On February 20th, 1942, a Japanese bomber pilot named Warrant Officer Chuzo Watanabe held his Mitsubishi G4M steady at 11,000 feet and watched the ocean below for the shape of an American aircraft carrier. He was flying the lead bomber of the 1st Chutai, the command section of a strike force that had launched from Vunakanau airfield near Rabaul less than 2 hours earlier. Behind him and around him, 7 more twin-engine bombers held formation, 8 aircraft in all. Each one carried 2 550-pound bombs capable of crippling or sinking a capital ship. Watanabe's passenger was the strike commander himself, Lieutenant Commander Takuzo Ito, one of the most experienced bomber leaders in the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Air Group. Ito had reason to be confident. His crews were veterans. His aircraft, the G4M, was the longest-ranged land-based bomber in any navy on Earth. And the target, the American carrier Lexington, had already been spotted by a Japanese flying boat hours earlier. The Americans knew the bombers were coming. The bombers knew the Americans knew. And none of it mattered, because 8 bombers attacking a single carrier from multiple angles was a problem that no fighter defense could solve. That was the mathematics of naval air warfare as every navy in the world understood it in early 1942. You send enough bombers, you saturate the defense, and you sink the ship. The mathematics was clean. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked against the British at Malaya. It would work again here. Except it did not. What happened in the next 4 minutes violated every calculation Ito had made, and every assumption the Japanese naval air arm had built its doctrine around. A single American fighter, one plane, dove out of the sky above the formation and began killing bombers, not harassing them, not forcing them to jettison their weapons and turn away, killing them. One after another, in rapid passes so precise and so fast that the rear gunners in the surviving bombers could barely track the attacker before he was gone and coming back from the other side. By the time it was over, the formation that Ito had led with such confidence was burning wreckage scattered across miles of Pacific Ocean. Ito himself was dead. Watanabe, his pilot, attempted to crash his crippled bomber into the Lexington in a final act of defiance. He missed. The bomber hit the water near the carrier and disappeared. Of the 17 G4M bombers that had launched from Vunakanau that afternoon, only 2 made it back to base. 15 were destroyed. And the man who had broken the attack, the man who had stood alone between a bomber squadron and an aircraft carrier carrying more than 2,000 American sailors, landed on the Lexington's flight deck, climbed out of his cockpit, and walked across the deck as if he had just come back from a routine patrol. If this story reaches you, a like helps it find others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. His name was Lieutenant Edward Henry O'Hare. The men who flew with him called him Butch. He was 27 years old. He had been a naval aviator for less than 2 years. And 2 months after that afternoon over the Pacific, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt placed the Medal of Honor around his neck and read aloud a citation that contained a sentence no American military aviator had ever heard before and none has heard since. The president called O'Hare's action, quote, one of the most daring, if not the most daring, single action in the history of combat aviation, end quote. That was not a journalist's exaggeration. That was not a publicist's invention. That was the official judgment of the United States Navy, written into a Medal of Honor citation and read aloud by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States in the East Room of the White House. The most daring single action in the history of combat aviation. 1 man, 1 fighter, 34 seconds of ammunition, and a story that begins not in a cockpit over the Pacific, but in a courtroom in Chicago, where Butch O'Hare's father made a choice that cost him everything. Because the man who produced America's first naval ace of the Second World War was not a military hero. He was a lawyer who worked for the most dangerous criminal in America. And the reason Butch O'Hare flew the way he did, the reason he attacked alone without hesitation, the reason he carried inside him something that no amount of flight training alone can explain, has everything to do with how his father lived and how his father died. But that story requires patience. And before we reach it, you need to understand what the Pacific looked like in February of 1942, because without that context, the weight of what one pilot did on one afternoon cannot be fully measured. In the 10 weeks between the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and the afternoon of February 20th, 1942, the United States Navy had suffered the most catastrophic series of losses in its history. The battleship fleet, the pride of the Pacific, had been smashed at anchor in Hawaii. 8 battleships, damaged or destroyed in a single morning. The Pacific was no longer an American ocean, it was a Japanese one. The speed of the Japanese advance was almost incomprehensible. Wake Island had fallen on December 23rd after a heroic but doomed defense by a handful of Marines. Guam had been taken on December 10th, barely 48 hours after the war began. Japanese forces had landed in the Philippines on December 22nd and were grinding toward Manila against a retreating American and Filipino army. In Malaya, the British were being driven down the peninsula toward Singapore. On December 10th, Japanese bombers had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse in the South China Sea, proving what Pearl Harbor had suggested. The age of the battleship was over. The age of air power had arrived, and in the air, the Japanese were dominant everywhere. In January of 1942, the Japanese captured Rabaul, the great natural harbour on the island of New Britain in the Bismarck archipelago. Within weeks, they had turned it into the most powerful Japanese air and naval base south of the home islands. From Rabaul, Japanese bombers could reach deep into the Solomon Islands, threaten New Guinea, and project power toward the sea lanes connecting Australia to the United States. If those sea lanes were cut, Australia would be isolated. And if Australia was isolated, the Allies would lose their only base for a counteroffensive in the South Pacific. Against this avalanche, the United States Navy had exactly 4 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific. 4. The Lexington, the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Saratoga. And then there were 3, because on January 11th, 1942, a Japanese submarine put a torpedo into the Saratoga south of Oahu, and she limped back to the west coast for months of repair. When the Saratoga left for repairs, her air group, including Fighting Squadron 3 with Butch was transferred to the Lexington on January 31st. 3 carriers to hold an ocean that stretched 6,000 miles from Hawaii to Australia. Lose 1, and the balance of the Pacific War shifted. Lose 2, and the Japanese Navy would operate without meaningful opposition from Pearl Harbor to the coast of California. The mathematics was that stark. The margin for error was 0. Every sailor, every pilot, every admiral in the Pacific Fleet understood this arithmetic. In February of 1942, the carriers were not just ships, they were the war. If they survived, America could fight. If they did not, America would spend 1942 retreating. And every mission those carriers flew was a gamble, because the one thing the Navy could not do was replace a carrier that was sunk. American shipyards were building new carriers as fast as they could. The Essex class, the ships that would eventually win the Pacific War, were under construction in yards from Virginia to Massachusetts. But the first of them would not be ready until the end of 1942 at the earliest. Until then, the fleet had what it had: 3 carriers, no margin, no safety net. It was into this arithmetic that Vice Admiral Wilson Brown sailed his Task Force 11, built around the Lexington, toward the Japanese fortress at Rabaul in the 3rd week of February. The task force included the Lexington under Captain Frederick Sherman, the heavy cruisers Minneapolis, Indianapolis, Pensacola, and San Francisco, and a screen of destroyers. The mission was a raid. Brown's task force would launch airstrikes against Japanese shipping and installations at Rabaul, demonstrate that the Americans could still project power into enemy waters, and withdraw before the Japanese could concentrate enough force to threaten the carrier. It was a calculated gamble. Every carrier mission in early 1942 was a gamble, Because every carrier mission put one of America's 3 irreplaceable flight decks within range of enemy attack. Rabaul was deep inside Japanese-controlled waters, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly base. The nearest help, if something went wrong, was days away. And if the Japanese found the Lexington before the strike launched, the entire mission would flip from offense to defense in seconds. The predator would become the prey. On the morning of February 20th, the Japanese found them. A Kawanishi H-6K flying boat, a massive 4-engine reconnaissance aircraft, the Allies would later designate by the code name Mavis, spotted the task force steaming northwest toward Rabaul and began transmitting its position to Japanese headquarters. American fighters from the Lexington intercepted the flying boat and shot it down. But the damage was done. Rabaul knew the Americans were coming. The element of surprise, the one advantage a carrier raid depends upon, was gone. Vice Admiral Brown made the only responsible decision available to him. He cancelled the strike. There would be no raid on Rabaul. The task force would reverse course and withdraw. But withdrawal takes time, and the Japanese were not going to let an American carrier escape without a fight. At Vunakanau airfield outside Rabaul, the 4th Air Group scrambled 17 G-4M-1 bombers. The G-4M was the longest-ranged land-based bomber in any navy on Earth. Its Japanese crews called it the hamaki, meaning cigar, a darkly humorous reference to its cylindrical fuselage and its alarming tendency to catch fire when hit. Allied pilots had their own name for it. They called it the one-shot lighter, because a single incendiary round in its unprotected wing fuel tanks could turn the aircraft into a fireball. Despite this vulnerability, the G-4M could carry a heavy bomb load over enormous distances. On this mission, each bomber was armed with 2 250-kilogram bombs. 17 of them, properly handled, could cripple a carrier. The bombers launched in 2 waves, 2 chutai, and flew southeast toward the American task force. They expected to find a carrier defended by fighters. They expected to take losses. They expected that the mathematics of saturation, enough bombers from enough angles, would overwhelm whatever defense the Americans could put up. What they did not expect was what they actually found. Now we need to go back. Not to the flight deck of the Lexington, but further, to a boy growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, in the 1920s, whose father was about to make a deal with the devil and then betray him. Edward Joseph O'Hare, known to everyone as Easy Eddie, was a lawyer and businessman in St. Louis who discovered in the early 1920s that he had a remarkable talent for making money in ways that did not always respect the boundaries of the law. He became involved in the dog racing business, and through a patented mechanical rabbit device used at racetracks, he came into contact with a man whose name would define organized crime in America for a generation. Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Al Capone. Easy Eddie's racing operations were enormously profitable, and Capone wanted a share. By the late 1920s, Easy Eddie O'Hare had become one of Capone's most important business associates. He managed racing operations across multiple states. He handled legal matters. He moved in the orbit of the most powerful and most violent criminal organization in the country. He lived well. He drove expensive cars. He owned property. And all the while, he was raising a son. Edward Henry O'Hare, born March 13, 1914, in St. Louis. A boy with 2 older sisters, Patricia and Marilyn. The boy his family called Butch. Butch O'Hare's childhood was split by his parents' divorce in 1927. He was 13 years old. He stayed with his mother, Selma, in St. Louis, while Easy Eddie moved to Chicago to deepen his work with Capone's organization. But the divorce did not sever the bond between father and son. Easy Eddie remained devoted to Butch. He visited when he could, he wrote letters, and he paid for the boy's education at Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, a structured, disciplined environment far removed from the world of speakeasies and shotgun murders that Easy Eddie inhabited in Chicago. It was at Western Military Academy that young Butch discovered 2 things that would shape the rest of his short life. He discovered that he was an exceptional marksman, becoming president of the school's rifle club. And he discovered that he wanted to serve his country. At Western Military Academy, one of his classmates was another young man who would later become famous for an act of extraordinary consequence. That classmate was Paul Tibbets, who would one day pilot the Enola Gay over Hiroshima. But while Butch was learning discipline and marksmanship at military school, his father was making a decision that would change both their lives. Sometime in the early 1930s, Easy Eddie O'Hare began cooperating with federal investigators working to build a tax evasion case against Al Capone. The exact reasons have been debated by historians and biographers for decades, and the truth is probably a combination of motives rather than a single dramatic turning point. Some historians believe Eddie wanted to clear the path for his son's admission to the United States Naval Academy, knowing that a father's criminal associations could block an appointment. The Naval Academy conducted background checks. A father on the wrong side of the law could disqualify a candidate before he ever set foot in Annapolis. Others believe Eddie had simply seen enough of Capone's violence and wanted out. He had watched men disappear. He had seen what happened to people who crossed the organization. Perhaps he decided that the money was not worth what it cost to earn. Whatever the reason, whatever combination of paternal love and personal conscience drove the decision, Easy Eddie became one of the most valuable undercover informants the federal government ever had. He worked directly with IRS investigator Frank Wilson, who would later call him one of the best undercover men he had ever known. Eddie directed Wilson to the bookkeeper whose testimony would prove critical. He helped federal agents break the coded ledger system that Capone's gambling operations used to hide income. And in the final weeks before the 1931 trial, Eddie tipped off the government that Capone had fixed the jury, a warning that prompted the judge to switch jury panels on the morning the trial began. The tax evasion case that sent Capone to prison for 11 years succeeded in large part because Easy Eddie had provided the keys that unlocked it. He did this knowing what it would cost. In Capone's world, in the world of organized crime in 1930s Chicago, cooperation with the government carried one penalty. There was no negotiation, there was no second chance. There was only the certainty that eventually someone would come. On November 8, 1939, Edward Joseph O'Hare was driving his car on Ogden Avenue in Chicago when another car pulled alongside and someone opened fire with a shotgun. Easy Eddie was killed instantly. He was 46 years old. The murder was never officially solved, but no one who knew the circumstances, no investigator, no journalist, no colleague, had any doubt about why it happened. Easy Eddie had betrayed the most dangerous criminal organization in America, and the organization had collected its debt. Butch O'Hare was 25 years old when his father was murdered. By then, he had already entered the United States Naval Academy on July 24, 1933, graduated with the class of 1937, ranking 255th out of 323 midshipmen, and served 2 years aboard the battleship New Mexico. He was not a scholar, he was a doer. When his father was killed, Butch was preparing to enter flight training. He reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola and earned his wings as Naval Aviator No. 6, 405 on May 2, 1940. He married a nurse named Rita Grace Worcester in September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor changed everything. Easy Eddie never saw any of it, but the path his son was walking was the path Eddie had helped clear at the cost of his own life. Whether Butch O'Hare ever spoke about his father's death publicly is not recorded in any source that survives. What is recorded is what he did next. He joined Fighting Squadron 3, VF3, under the command of a lieutenant commander named John Smith Thach. And that assignment, that specific squadron under that specific commander, is where the story turns from biography into something else entirely. Because Jimmy Thach was not just a squadron commander. He was a man who was quietly reinventing how fighter pilots fought. And the training he gave Butch O'Hare is the reason O'Hare was able to do what he did on February 20th, 1942. Without Thach, O'Hare would have been just another brave pilot flying into a bomber formation, brave and dead. What Thach gave him was the difference between courage and lethality. Lieutenant Commander John Thach had a problem. The fighter his squadron flew, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was not the best fighter in the Pacific. It was, to put it plainly, outclassed. The Japanese Zero, the Mitsubishi A-6M, was faster in level flight, climbed at nearly twice the rate, turned inside the Wildcat with ease, and carried two 20mm cannons alongside its machine guns. In a one-on-one dogfight, the kind of turning, twisting, close-range combat that fighter pilots trained for, the Zero held almost every advantage. The only areas where the Wildcat was superior were in diving speed, structural strength, and the ability to absorb damage and keep flying. A Wildcat could take punishment that would tear a Zero apart. But taking punishment was not a strategy, it was a consolation. The standard American approach to air combat, inherited from the First World War and refined in the interwar years, was built around individual dogfighting. Get on an enemy's tail and stay there. Out-turn him, out-climb him, out-maneuver him. Against the Zero, that approach was a recipe for getting killed. Thach knew this before the war started. He had studied intelligence reports from China, where the Zero had been devastating Chinese and American volunteer pilots who tried to fight it on its own terms. He had read the Fleet Air Tactical Unit intelligence bulletins that described the Zero's performance in chilling detail. And Thach understood with crystalline clarity that if his squadron flew the way they had been trained, using the tactics the Navy had taught them, and they would be destroyed in their first engagement. So Thach did something that most commanders in any military would have considered dangerous, bordering on insubordinate. He threw out the existing playbook and built a new one from scratch, testing it with his own pilots in training flights over the Pacific before the war came. He developed a defensive maneuver that paired two fighters working together, each one protecting the other's blind spots, weaving back and forth in a crossing pattern that turned the Zero's agility advantage against it. If a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, the other Wildcat would turn into the attack, forcing the Zero to either break off or fly directly into the second fighter's guns. The maneuver required trust. Absolute, unthinking trust between two pilots who had to believe that their wingman would be exactly where he was supposed to be at the exact moment he was needed. The maneuver would later be called the Thach Weave, and it would become one of the most important tactical innovations of the entire Pacific Air War. It is still taught in modified form in fighter training programs today. O'Hare himself helped Thach test the weave in pre-war training exercises. After one of those tests, O'Hare walked up to Thach and told him, quote, "Skipper, it really works," end quote. But the Thach weave was only half of what Thach taught his pilots. The other half was how to shoot. Standard gunnery training in the Navy taught pilots to get behind an enemy aircraft and fire from directly astern. It was the simplest shot. It was also, against a bomber formation with rear-facing gunners, the most dangerous. A pilot who attacked from directly behind a bomber was flying straight into the guns of the rear gunner, the waist gunner, and often the top turret gunner of the aircraft in front of him. 3 guns pointed at one plane approaching on a predictable path. The mathematics of that exchange favored the bomber crew, not the fighter pilot. Thach taught his pilots a different way. He drilled them relentlessly in deflection shooting, the art of firing at a target from an angle, leading the target so that the bullets and the aircraft arrived at the same point in space at the same moment. Deflection shooting was enormously difficult. It required a pilot to calculate angles, speeds, and distances in his head while flying at 300 miles per hour, pulling several times the force of gravity, and tracking a target that was itself moving and possibly maneuvering. Most pilots could not do it consistently. The ones who could were devastating, because a deflection attack from the side or from above gave the bomber's gunners almost no time to track the fighter and almost no angle to return effective fire. The fighter pilot appeared, fired, and was gone before the gunners could react. O'Hare was one of the best deflection shooters Thach had ever trained, and the reason that mattered is not simply that he was talented. It mattered because of what deflection shooting allowed him to do with his ammunition. The F-4 F-3 Wildcat carried 450 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 450 rounds. At the gun's rate of fire, that gave the pilot roughly 34 seconds of total trigger time. 34 seconds. After that, the guns were empty, and the fighter was an unarmed airplane in the middle of an enemy formation. A pilot who fired from directly behind a bomber needed long bursts to score hits, because the geometry was forgiving but the closure rate was slow and the target presented its smallest profile. A long burst might last 3 or 4 seconds, and might or might not be lethal. 6 or 7 such passes and the ammunition was gone. A pilot who attacked from a deflection angle needed short bursts, sometimes less than a second, because the geometry amplified every hit. A round that struck a bomber's wing spar at 90 degrees did far more damage than one that hit the same spar at a shallow angle from behind. Deflection shooting was harder to learn, but it was brutally efficient. And efficiency was the only thing that could make one fighter effective against 9 bombers. Thach did not know, when he was training O'Hare in those pre-war exercises, that he was building a weapon that would one day be the only thing standing between a Japanese bomber squadron and an American aircraft carrier. He was simply training his pilots the best way he knew how. But the best way he knew how turned out to be the only way that would have worked on the afternoon of February 20th, 1942. Now, we return to that afternoon. Task Force 11's radar, still a relatively new and imperfect technology in early 1942, detected the incoming Japanese bombers at approximately 3:42 in the afternoon. The blips appeared on the screen at the edge of detection range, a cluster of contacts approaching from the direction of Rabaul. The Lexington's fighter direction officer began vectoring every available Wildcat toward the incoming raid. This was a frantic process. Fighters had to be located, their positions confirmed by radio, their fuel states checked, and their vectors calculated so they would arrive at the right altitude and the right bearing to intercept before the bombers reached their drop point. Every minute mattered. Every second of delay meant the bombers were a mile closer to the ship. The Japanese had approached in 2 separate waves from different bearings, and the American fighters were spread thin, trying to cover all the approach angles simultaneously. Thach himself led the main group of Wildcats against the first wave, the 9 bombers of the second Chutai. His fighters tore into the formation with devastating effect, shooting down 5 of the 9 bombers between roughly 4:39 and 4:43 in the afternoon. The first wave was shattered. But Thach's fighters were now committed, low on ammunition, out of position, and unable to reach the second wave in time. Because the second wave, the first Chutai of 8 or 9 bombers led by Lieutenant Commander Ito, had come in from a different direction, exploiting exactly the kind of gap that a determined attacker with multiple approach axes can create against a defender with limited fighters. And the only fighters in position to intercept were 2 Wildcats. One was flown by O'Hare, the other was flown by his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Marion Dufilio, whom everyone called Duff. The 2 Wildcats dove toward the bomber formation, and then Dufilio's guns jammed, all 4 of them. He was flying an armed aircraft, with no weapons. He pulled away, and began frantically working to clear the jam. O'Hare was alone. Consider what that moment required. A moment that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, between the instant Dufilio pulled away and the instant O'Hare made his choice. You are 27 years old. You are flying a single-seat fighter with 34 seconds of ammunition. You are roughly 1,500 feet above a formation of heavy twin-engine bombers, each one crewed by 7 men, each one armed with tail guns, dorsal turrets, and waist guns, each one carrying enough ordnance to cripple or sink the ship below. That ship is the aircraft carrier Lexington, home to more than 2,000 American sailors, one of only 3 operational carriers left in the entire Pacific. Standard doctrine says a single fighter does not attack a bomber formation alone. The defensive crossfire from 9 bombers, more than 30 gun positions firing simultaneously, will cut you apart before you can inflict meaningful damage. Every tactical manual, every classroom lecture, every piece of conventional wisdom accumulated from 25 years of aerial warfare says the same thing. Do not do this. Wait for help. Trail the formation. Report their bearing and altitude, and let the ship's anti-aircraft guns try to break up the attack on their own. O'Hare did not wait. He rolled his Wildcat over and dove on the bombers. He came in from above and to the right side of the formation, exactly the high-side deflection angle that Thach had drilled into him during hundreds of hours of gunnery practice. He was not aiming at the center of the bomber he targeted. He was aiming at the space the bomber would occupy a fraction of a second later, leading the target, letting the geometry do the killing. His first burst was short, less than 2 seconds of fire. The trailing bomber on the right side of the formation shuddered. Its right engine nacelle blew apart. Fuel streamed from the shattered wing. The bomber rolled and fell away, trailing fire. O'Hare pulled up, rolled hard, crossed over the top of the formation, and came down on the left side. Another burst, another bomber staggering, fuel burning, falling. He was working the formation from the outside in, always attacking the trailing aircraft, always coming from an angle that gave the other bomber's gunners no clear shot at him. By the time a rear gunner on one bomber had swung his weapon to track O'Hare, the Wildcat was already gone, pulling up and crossing to the other side for the next pass. The surviving bombers held formation and pressed their attack. Their discipline was remarkable and earned. These were experienced crews from the 4th Air Group, and they did not break. They continued boring straight toward the Lexington, accepting the losses and trusting in the mathematics of saturation. If enough of them reached their drop point, they could still put their bombs on the carrier's flight deck. O'Hare was not just trying to shoot down bombers. He was trying to disrupt their aiming solution, to force them to jink or scatter or release early, to destroy the precision that a level bombing attack required. And he was doing it while watching his ammunition counter in his head, knowing that every burst brought him closer to the moment when his guns would go silent and he would be an unarmed airplane in the middle of hostile formation. He came in again and again, burning through his remaining ammunition in disciplined bursts that reflected everything Thach had taught him about economy and precision. By the time reinforcements arrived, Thach himself among them, at least 3 bombers were falling in flames at the same time. Thach later recalled seeing the sky full of burning aircraft and O'Hare's Wildcat weaving between them with an almost impossible calm, as if the chaos around him was something he had rehearsed. The official Navy count credited O'Hare with 5 bombers destroyed and a 6th damaged in approximately 4 minutes of combat. Later scholarship, drawing on Japanese records recovered after the war, concluded that the confirmed number was likely 3 of the 8 bombers in the second wave, with damage to others. The discrepancy is not unusual. In the chaos of air combat, with multiple pilots engaging the same targets and bombers breaking apart over miles of ocean, precise attribution is nearly impossible. What is not disputed, what neither American nor Japanese sources contest, is the central fact. One pilot, alone, attacked a formation of heavy bombers and disrupted the attack so completely that the Lexington was not hit. Not one bomb struck the ship. The nearest explosion landed in the water roughly 100 feet astern. Captain Frederick Sherman, the Lexington's commanding officer, and Vice Admiral Brown both concluded that O'Hare's solo attack had saved the ship from severe damage and possibly from destruction. 2,000 sailors owed their lives to 4 minutes of flying. When O'Hare landed on the Lexington, the deck crews counted a single bullet hole in his Wildcat. One round, fired by a Japanese rear gunner during one of his passes, had passed through his port wing and disabled his airspeed indicator. That was the only damage. His aircraft was otherwise untouched. The man who had just flown alone into the concentrated defensive fire of 9 bombers had come back with less damage than most pilots collected in a routine training flight. O'Hare himself, when asked to describe the action, gave an account so modest it bordered on evasion. In a press interview shortly after the battle, he recalled the moment in words that have been passed down through multiple accounts of the engagement. He said that they had about 10 planes in the air, that the first group of fighters was working over the first wave of bombers, and that he and his wingman had the second wave all to themselves. His wingman had gun trouble, and by the time the guns were fixed, it was all over. That was it. The most daring single action in the history of combat aviation, reduced to a few sentences that made it sound like a minor inconvenience on an otherwise routine afternoon. This was not false modesty. O'Hare genuinely did not seem to regard what he had done as extraordinary. He had been trained. He had been in position. The enemy had come. He had done his job. The idea that his job had been remarkable apparently did not occur to him, or if it did, he chose not to say so. There is a moment after the landing that captures something about O'Hare that no medal citation can convey. As he was making his approach to the Lexington, one of the ship's anti-aircraft gunners, a young sailor whose nerves were still raw from the attack, opened fire on O'Hare's Wildcat. American guns shooting at an American plane returning from the fight that had just saved them. O'Hare landed safely despite the friendly fire. He climbed out of his cockpit, walked over to the gun position, found the young gunner who had shot at him, and said, quote, "Son, if you don't stop shooting at me when I have got my wheels down, I am going to have to report you to the gunnery officer." End quote. The sailor apologized. O'Hare walked away. No anger, no dramatics, the same steadiness on the flight deck that he had shown in the air. As if the entire afternoon, the bombers, the solo attack, the 4 minutes that earned him the Medal of Honor, had been simply what the day required. When the Navy announced O'Hare's action on March 3, 1942, the United States was desperate for good news. The Philippines were falling. Singapore had surrendered to the Japanese on February 15th. The Dutch East Indies were collapsing. American morale was at its lowest point since Pearl Harbor. Into that darkness came the story of a 27-year-old lieutenant from St. Louis who had taken on a bomber squadron alone and won. The Navy recognized what it had, not just a hero, but a symbol. Proof that the Japanese were not invincible. Proof that one American, properly trained and properly determined, could change the mathematics of a battle that arithmetic said he should have lost. On April 21, 1942, O'Hare stood in the East Room of the White House. President Roosevelt read the Medal of Honor citation aloud. O'Hare's wife, Rita, a nurse he had married in September of 1941, placed the medal around his neck. The citation ended with the words that would define his legacy, one of the most daring, if not the most daring, single action in the history of combat aviation. O'Hare was promoted 2 ranks to lieutenant commander. He became a national figure overnight. The Navy sent him on war bond tours across the country, where he spoke to crowds and shook hands and posed for photographs and did all the things that heroes are asked to do when their country needs them to be visible. America, in the spring of 1942, was hungry for heroes. The war was going badly on every front. Bataan had fallen. Corregidor was under siege. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. And into that gloom came a young lieutenant from St. Louis, with a quick smile and a quiet manner, who had stood alone against a bomber squadron and won. The public loved him. The newspapers loved him. The Navy loved him most of all, because O'Hare was proof that American training, American technology, and American courage could beat the Japanese. He was the antidote to the despair of Pearl Harbor. O'Hare did the tours well, because he was a man who did everything he was asked to do. But those who knew him, those who flew with him and drank coffee with him in the ready room, said he was uncomfortable with the attention. He did not enjoy being famous. He did not enjoy standing on stages and telling the story of something that, to him, had simply been his job. He wanted to be back with his squadron. He wanted to fly. He wanted to be useful in the way he knew best, which was sitting in a cockpit with his hand on the stick and his eye on the gun sight, not standing on a podium with a medal around his neck. There is a detail about the aftermath that has been largely overlooked in the decades since. O'Hare's action did not just save the Lexington. It had a strategic consequence that rippled far beyond that single afternoon. The Japanese 4th Air Group lost 15 of 17 bombers on February 20th. Those losses were so severe that the Japanese were forced to postpone their planned invasion of Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea from March 3 to March 8, 1942. 5 days. In the arithmetic of the Pacific War in early 1942, 5 days was an enormous amount of time. It was time for the Allies to reinforce, to prepare, to observe. The delay had consequences that cascaded through the campaign in New Guinea for weeks afterward. One pilot's 4 minutes of combat had altered the timetable of the Japanese advance across the South Pacific. But here is the part of the story that most people never hear. The part that takes Butch O'Hare beyond the Medal of Honor and into something more complex and more costly than a single afternoon of heroism. Because O'Hare did not stop after February 20th, he went back to the war, and the second time, the war did not let him come home. After the Bond tours, O'Hare returned to the Pacific. He was given command of Fighting Squadron 6, and later Air Group 6, aboard the carrier Enterprise, the most famous warship in the American fleet. He was no longer a junior lieutenant making a name. He was a squadron commander, responsible for dozens of pilots and hundreds of maintenance crews. And he was thinking about a problem that no one in naval aviation had yet solved. The problem was night attacks. By 1943, as the American carrier forces pushed deeper into Japanese-controlled waters, the Japanese had begun launching torpedo bomber strikes against American carriers after dark. The tactic was devastatingly simple and devastatingly effective. A carrier task group at night was almost defenseless against air attack. Radar could detect the incoming bombers miles away, but fighters could not find them in the darkness, and even if they could, the risk of shooting at friendly aircraft or crashing into unseen obstacles or being shot down by the anti-aircraft guns of their own ships made night interception almost suicidally dangerous. The standard response when Japanese bombers were detected approaching at night was to darken the ships, increase speed, maneuver evasively, and hope the bombers could not find the task force in the darkness or could not line up a clean torpedo run. It was a passive defense, a defense built on hope rather than action. And it was not working reliably, because Japanese air crews were skilled and determined, and a carrier outlined against even faint starlight or moonlight was not invisible. O'Hare decided that hoping was not good enough. He began developing a tactic for night fighter interception launched from a carrier, a concept so radical that most of the Navy's aviation establishment considered it impractical, bordering on impossible. The concept worked like this: a small team of aircraft, a radar-equipped TB-F Avenger torpedo bomber to find the enemy, and 1 or 2 F-6F Hellcat fighters to shoot them down, would launch from the carrier at night, guided by the ship's radar toward the incoming raid. The Avenger would use its own airborne radar to locate individual bombers in the darkness and would talk the Hellcat fighters onto the targets using radio. The fighters would close to visual range, perhaps a few hundred yards, identify the target against the sky, and fire. Nobody had ever tried this from an aircraft carrier in combat. The coordination required between the radar plane, the fighters, and the ship was staggering. A single miscommunication, a single wrong turn, a single moment of confusion about who was friend and who was enemy in the pitch-dark sky could result in Americans killing Americans. The risks were obvious to everyone who heard the plan. O'Hare heard them too. He insisted on leading the first mission himself. He would not send another pilot to test a tactic he had devised. On the night of November 26, 1943, during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, Japanese torpedo bombers approached the Enterprise task group after dark. O'Hare launched with his Black Panther team. He was flying an F-6F Hellcat, the successor to the Wildcat that had carried him over the Lexington 21 months earlier. His radar plane was a TB-F Avenger, flown by Lieutenant Commander John Phillips, with a radar officer named Hazen Rand and a gunner named Alvin Kernan. What happened next has been debated for decades. The team made contact with the incoming Japanese bombers. In the darkness, with multiple aircraft maneuvering at close range, the situation became chaotic. O'Hare's Hellcat disappeared. He did not return to the Enterprise. No distress call was received, no wreckage was found, no body was recovered. For years, the assumption was that O'Hare had been killed by friendly fire, perhaps by the guns of his own radar plane in the confusion of the night action. It was a bitter theory, the idea that America's first naval ace had been killed by his own side. But historians, Steve Ewing and John Lundstrom, working with both American and Japanese records and interviewing surviving participants including Rand and Kernan, concluded in their 1997 book that O'Hare was most likely killed by fire from one of the Japanese G-4M bombers he was attacking, the same type of aircraft he had fought over the Lexington, the Bettys, the one-shot lighters. Lieutenant Commander Edward Henry O'Hare was 29 years old. He left behind his wife Rita and a daughter, Kathleen, who had been born on February 6, 1943, almost exactly 1 year after the action that made her father famous. He never saw her grow up. He never went home to St. Louis. His body lies somewhere in the Pacific, in the dark water where his plane went down, in the same ocean where he had once saved a carrier and 2,000 lives with 34 seconds of ammunition. The Navy declared O'Hare dead and awarded him a Second Navy Cross, posthumously, for the night action that killed him. He had already received the Distinguished Flying Cross, with 1 gold star for strikes at Marcus Island and Wake Island earlier in 1943. His full list of awards reads like a catalogue of courage. Medal of Honor, Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart. But awards are metal and ribbon. They do not capture what O'Hare was, or what he meant, or why his story carries weight beyond the combat actions that earned them. On September 19, 1949, the city of Chicago renamed its major airport. Orchard Field became O'Hare International Airport. Today, it is one of the busiest airports in the world. Tens of millions of people pass through it every year. Most of them do not know whose name is on the building. Most of them do not know that the airport is named for a 27-year-old pilot who dove alone into 9 bombers with 34 seconds of ammunition and came back with 1 bullet hole in his wing. Most of them walk past the small memorial display near Terminal 2 without stopping. But here is what deserves to be said, and what separates this story from a simple account of aerial combat. The question is not whether Butch O'Hare was brave. He was obviously brave. The question that matters, the one that reaches beyond the 4 minutes over the Lexington and into something larger, is what made him capable of doing what he did. Not willing, capable. Because the willingness to attack a bomber formation alone is not rare among fighter pilots. The capacity to do it effectively, to survive it, to destroy 5 aircraft or 3 aircraft or any aircraft at all, while flying alone into concentrated defensive fire with 34 seconds of ammunition, that is something else entirely. The answer has 3 parts. The first part is Jimmy Thach, the training that Thach gave his pilots, the deflection shooting, the Thach weave, the relentless emphasis on economy and precision over brute force, was what made O'Hare lethal rather than simply brave. A pilot trained in the old way, attacking from directly behind, would have been shot down on his 2nd or 3rd pass. O'Hare's angled attacks, his short bursts, his discipline with ammunition, those were not instincts. They were skills, taught by a commander who understood that the next war would not be won by pilots who flew harder, but by pilots who flew smarter. Thach built a system of training that multiplied individual talent into something the enemy could not predict or counter. O'Hare was the proof that the system worked. The second part is the Navy itself. In February of 1942, the United States Navy trusted a 27-year-old lieutenant, a man who had been a combat pilot for less than 3 months, to be the sole defender of an aircraft carrier worth more than any single human being aboard it. No committee made that decision. No admiral authorized it. The situation required it, and the Navy's system had placed a man in that cockpit who could meet the requirement. That was not an accident. That was a reflection of a military culture that, for all its flaws and rigidities, understood that in the critical moment, the man in the cockpit is the one who decides. Not the admiral on the bridge. Not the captain in the combat information center. The pilot. The Navy trained O'Hare to think for himself, to assess a situation without waiting for orders, and to act on his own judgment when the situation demanded it. That training saved the Lexington, because there was no time for orders, no time for doctrine, no time for anything except one man's judgment and one man's skill. The third part is Easy Eddie. This is the piece that no tactical analysis can capture and no training manual can replicate. Butch O'Hare grew up as the son of a man who worked for Al Capone and then chose to betray him. Easy Eddie O'Hare knew what cooperation with the federal government would cost. He did it anyway. The reasons may have been complicated. They may have included a father's desire to clear the way for his son's career. They may have included guilt or exhaustion or a late blooming sense that a life spent serving a criminal enterprise was a life badly spent. But whatever the reasons, the act itself was simple. Easy Eddie chose to do the right thing, knowing it would likely kill him, and it did. Butch O'Hare was 25 years old when his father was shot dead on a Chicago street. He never spoke publicly about what that loss meant to him. But consider the son. Consider a young man who watches his father choose integrity over survival and pay the ultimate price for it. Consider what that teaches a young man about the relative value of staying safe and doing what the situation requires. Consider what kind of pilot that young man becomes when the situation requires him to fly alone into 9 bombers, and the safe thing to do is to wait for help that might not arrive in time. O'Hare did not wait. His father had not waited either. The apple fell close to the tree, and the tree had been rooted in a soil where doing the right thing mattered more than what it cost. That combination, Thach's training, the Navy's trust, and a father's example, converged in one cockpit on one afternoon over the Pacific. And the result was 4 minutes that changed the course of a war, and earned a sentence that still stands in the record of American military history. The most daring single action in the history of combat aviation. Butch O'Hare is memorialized at the Courts of the Missing at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, the place they call the Punch Bowl. His name is carved into the wall alongside thousands of others whose remains were never recovered from the vast Pacific. The Navy named a destroyer after him, the USS O'Hare, DD-889, sponsored by his mother Selma. And of course, there is the airport, the busiest monument in America, visited by millions who do not know the story they are walking through. But there is one more thing about this story that is worth carrying with you. When O'Hare volunteered to lead that first night fighter mission off the Enterprise in November of 1943, he did not have to go. He was an air group commander. He was the Navy's most famous living ace. He had a Medal of Honor, a wife, and a daughter he had barely held. Any reasonable man would have let someone else fly the experimental mission into the darkness against an unknown number of enemy bombers with a tactic that had never been tested in combat. O'Hare chose to lead it himself. Not because he was reckless, not because he sought glory. He had more glory than any pilot in the Navy. He led it because the tactic was untested, the risk was real, and he would not ask his pilots to do something he was not willing to do first. That is the same instinct that drove him into 9 bombers over the Lexington. The same instinct his father showed on a Chicago street. The belief that when the moment comes, you do not send someone else, you go. He went, and the darkness took him. There is a sentence in O'Hare's Medal of Honor citation that is easy to read past, because the language around it is so dramatic. The citation says he acted, quote, at great personal risk, end quote. 4 words. They sound almost routine in a military citation, but place them against what actually happened. A man with 34 seconds of ammunition, no wingman, no backup, flying into the concentrated fire of 9 bomber crews, knowing that a single well-aimed burst from any one of them would kill him, knowing that if he failed, 2,000 men on the Lexington would face a bombing attack with no defense, at great personal risk. The phrase does not begin to cover it. What O'Hare accepted in those 4 minutes was not risk. It was near certainty of death, weighed against certainty that inaction would cost the ship. He chose the option that gave the Lexington a chance, even if it gave him almost none. He survived. That afternoon, he survived. 19 months later, in the dark over the Gilbert Islands, the mathematics finally caught up with him. But the Lexington survived too, and the men aboard her survived. And the war that those men fought in for the next 3.5 years was a war that America won. And the chain of events that led to that victory passes, in one critical link, through the cockpit of a Grumman Wildcat flown by a 27-year-old son of a dead gangster's lawyer who had 34 seconds of ammunition and the conviction that those 34 seconds were enough. Today, at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, there is a display in Terminal 2 that includes a restored F-4, F-3 Wildcat, an original aircraft recovered from Lake Michigan and repainted in O'Hare's markings. Travelers with boarding passes and rolling luggage glance at it as they hurry toward their gates. Most do not stop. Some take photographs. Very few read the plaque. The plaque tells a version of the story you have just heard, but shorter. It does not mention Easy Eddie. It does not mention Thach's gunnery training. It does not explain what 34 seconds of ammunition means when 9 bombers are heading for your ship. It does not describe the night over the Gilbert Islands, where the darkness closed around a Hellcat and did not give it back. Those parts of the story are why this video exists, because a plaque can hold a name and a date and a summary, but it cannot hold the weight of what one man did, or the weight of what made him the man who could do it. Thank you for spending these minutes with this story. If it reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor you grew up hearing stories from, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men and women carried a story like this one. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.